Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to QueerTalk. This is a session of roundtables, which we host as the Canon Collins Trust. We basically get to talk about all things queer, especially from a scholar activist perspective. So today we have in the house Clayton Moyer and Professor Gibson, who are going to be in conversation about the experiences of researching non-normative sexualities within the African Academy. For most of us who are in queer studies, who also research around gender and sexualities, we realize that doing that kind of work in Africa has a lot of kind of minefields that you have to navigate. So it is a pleasure and honor to be having Professor Gibson and Clayton to be in conversation around that particular issue as we get to share experiences and also get nuggets of how to navigate and maneuver the very controversial subject area, I must say. So welcome to everybody and thank you for taking your time to join us. Let me, before I give it up to Clayton, just quickly introduce Professor Gibson. I don't know if people can hear me, but in the meantime, I would also love for you to just type in your name, show us what you're studying or what you've studied and what interests you about today's roundtable. Like what brings you here? What is your point of interest with regards to the subjects that we are dealing with today? So just type it in the chat box. So I think I'll basically give it to Clayton now. To get into conversation. I'm sure you can also introduce the professor yourself.
Okay, thank you, Princess. I would like the professor rather to introduce himself, but my name is Clayton Moyer. I'm a Canon Collins scholar. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of the Witwatersrand, and my study focuses on how queerness intersects with national identities in Zimbabwe, particularly how that is mediated on mainstream media, what we call the dominant narratives, and on social media. I'm also a lecturer and I teach broadcast media at the National University of Science and Technology in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. That is what I do. Now, I think I can invite Prof. Ncube to just briefly tell us a bit about himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gibson, as Clayton has said, and I'm currently based at Stellenbosch University, where I teach in the Modern Foreign Languages department. My work has focused on the representation of queer sexualities in African cultural production, in literature and in film, and also music. I'm the current co-convener of the Queer Studies Association. Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, great, and thank you, Prof. Just to say, I've encountered so much of your work. It's part of what we read, and it's part of what part of what informs us in our studies. And thank you for that. So this field that we are in is a bit uncomfortable, honestly, but there are lots of opportunities, as I have just that has been my experience of late, that there is so much that is to be studied in this rather avoidable field of study, and you encounter rather lots of uncomfortable situations in whatever context that you are in, whether you are in your institution or you're trying to gather data, you're having conversations with friends. At times people asking me, so what's your, what are you studying? My experience is that at times it becomes an uncomfortable situation. Should I tell this person? To the point I say, oh, I'm studying national identities in Zimbabwe, and hoping that they won't ask further. That has helped a lot, but the question is, why do I avoid that? Anyway, I'm a bit of a storyteller because I'm also a journalist. So I would like to first highlight my first encounter with queer discourse, which was at home. It was my mother and a neighbor. That was in the late 90s. I was a kid then, and something had happened in South Africa. I think it was the constitution, the finalization of the constitution then. And my mother and my neighbor were talking about that. I understand it was covered in Zimbabwean media because it was a time when Robert Mugabe had also thrown a tantrum against homosexuals. And so it was really bound to be picked by the news. And I remember vividly the way they were having this conversation. Firstly, because there were kids in the room. And secondly, the subject that they were talking about wasn't one that is usually discussed. Prof, you speak about the paucity of terms when it comes to queer sexualities, especially within African context. And this was a Ndebele household, two Ndebele women trying to have a conversation on queer sexualities. I remember the neighbor stammering, saying, "Oh, so how do I'm sure they wanted to talk about the mechanics of sex, and they were really struggling to express themselves. Now I am studying this, and I'm finding that it's not really easy to have these conversations. So, Prof, I just want you to just say a bit about the context within which we study non-normative sexualities, especially in Africa. I understand that Africa is not the same. What obtains here in Zimbabwe and in South Africa and other parts of Africa is not necessarily, there are differences actually.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Clayton. I think before I answer it, I'll also quickly say when I first encountered queer, and it was watching TV as well with my parents. It was the soap opera on SABC Generations. I think no one in my family before had seen two men kissing, and it was a shock for them. So we'd watch this soap opera as a family every day. And from that time, we could not watch that soap opera anymore because my parents felt it was not good for us to be watching two men kissing. It just was too taboo for them at that time. And then going to your question on the context within which we work, I think I'm going to offer 3 anecdotes.
Yeah.
To map the kinds of contexts that I've worked on personally and what I've learned from these different contexts. So the first I'm going to refer to is when I worked at the University of Zimbabwe. So I applied for promotion, and one of the requirements is for you to submit the kinds of publications that you've worked on. And I did that and all the required things, and my papers were sent back, and I was told that the people who were in the committee felt that queer studies was not academic enough. They didn't feel queer studies was an academic enough field to warranty promotion at the university. So that's the first anecdote I'm going to refer to. And then the second is during a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study under the Isolomso Fellowship. So I think in 2019, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study had a meeting where different fellows of this fellowship met in Stellenbosch to talk about our work, and then to also go through some training in how to use social media and how to speak in public. So we had one particular session where we did public speaking, and we were supposed to record ourselves giving a 5-minute talk of our research. And after that, our videos were played to the fellows, and we're supposed to get feedback on on what to improve in our presentation styles, what was not good. And one of the comments that I got from the fellows was that I should get rid of queer hand gestures. And I was not too sure what they meant by queer hand gestures, but everyone in the room was kind of shocked, and they felt that that comment was not okay. And then the last anecdote I'm going to refer to is when I was teaching a module at WITS. It was on queer African studies, and I think 2 or 3 of the students, instead of engaging with the literary text that they were supposed to read, took the time in the class to rather say what was wrong about queerness in Africa and how queerness was un-African, how queerness was un-Christian. So instead of debating the literary text that they were supposed to, the students felt it necessary to them to rather discuss why it was wrong to even discuss those texts in the classroom. So I'm evoking these 3 different contexts to show what I've learned from each of them, and also what I've learned, the commonalities that I've noticed in the 3. And the commonalities that I've noticed are that researching non-normative sexualities is difficult in Africa because of the very homophobic and queerphobic context, number 1. And number 2, that you also have to deal with contexts which are not very accommodating to different or non-normative ways of experiencing lived experiences. And what I've also learned is the kind of stigmatization that goes with researching queer sexualities.
Yeah.
The question is always asked, for me personally, is if I'm queer, and I've wondered why that should be a question. Why not engage with the work that I'm presenting, for example, instead of asking me of my sexual orientation? And I've always wondered if, for example, a vet science person who's speaking about cows gets to be asked if they're a cow. So why should my sexuality or sexual orientation be a question at all because I'm working in this field? So yeah, in short, that's what I can say about the kind of context that we have to deal with when working in queer or non-normative sexual subjects on the continent.
Yeah, sure. I can relate to some of the situations that you've spoken about. Particularly the one of isolation, that at times you feel like, within an institution, you are probably the only one. The context is that I'm also in Zimbabwe, at a Zimbabwean university here. You're probably the only one who's starting that, and there is really not much, you think there's not much room to discuss these things. You only have these discussions if you're going to tackle something else about the media, and away from this subject is something that you if you want to discuss it, you are looking for others elsewhere. But I just want to focus on the institutions themselves, because one colleague said, they're finding it hard to get a supervisor, to secure a supervisor from their institution, because of that there's not as many people who are keen to take up this subject. Do you think the institutions themselves are accommodating? Because at some point you encounter some kind of hostility if you're having lectures, outside what you can term the institutional position. Do you think there is much that is happening in terms of accommodating queer studies in the institutions? Or are you also noting any differences? You are in South Africa now, and you were in Zimbabwe. Are you noting any differences there in terms of institutional approaches?
Yeah, there are obvious differences, I think. In Zimbabwe, yeah, I can relate to the question of isolation and yeah, not being able to speak about your own work freely. I think in the years that I worked at the University of Zimbabwe, like 13 years, I was never able to present my work, whether it's at a departmental seminar series or at the different conferences that I attended at the University of Zimbabwe. And which is slightly different here, I think. Although the institution has like legal frameworks in place to support transformation and the openness to different ways of being. It can also be difficult, I think, in the classroom where you have to deal with students who are not really open. So you do have students who come from, for example, very traditional backgrounds, very religious backgrounds, who are not able to engage and to speak in a very open-minded way. So yeah, so you do have on one hand, institutional approaches which are trying to open up, but at the same time, you have to deal with the very sad realities of interactions that you have with students or with colleagues in the departments. It's not very easy to speak about the kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah, and speaking of silences, perhaps just to think about how we may end up silencing ourselves. I said I'm a storyteller. I'm going to another story. This one is about my MSc thesis, which I did around 2015. Again, I was interrogating the discursive construction of national identities in Zimbabwe, but I was focusing on the Herald newspaper. Those who are not familiar with Zimbabwe, the Herald newspaper is a state-owned newspaper, the biggest newspaper in Zimbabwe. So I was looking at around election time, how do they construct what a Zimbabwean is? And just to summarize what I found quite interesting from the articles that I interrogated. One, I found out that between 2000 and 2013, towards elections, the Herald was presenting a Zimbabwean as a racialized subject, a black subject, a black person, to be very specific, that it's also a Zimbabwean is an ethnicized subject as well, someone who's of Shona ethnicity. This is what was coming out. And also someone with a very distinct political affiliation, someone who supports ZANU-PF. And this is what I saw in the Herald, right? And I remember presenting my findings to my institution's research day. And at the end, someone said to me, because look, it's a University of Science and Technology. Someone said to me, so what is a Zimbabwean? I then, obviously said, okay, I'll tell you what a Zimbabwean is according to the Herald during election time. And I repeated those things. But later, when I looked at what I had said to, in terms of how I presented my research, I found something missing, that a Zimbabwean is also gendered in particular ways. And a Zimbabwean, according to the Herald, also has a certain sexual identity. But I missed that. So the question is, did I look in the first place? Or, I failed the institution. Remember, there are processes here. The examiner didn't capture that. Even supervision as well didn't capture that. I also did. Of course, I shoulder the responsibility here. But I was thinking about how we then either silence ourselves or, consciously silence the subject itself. Do you think that that could be a challenge, especially for researchers, that because of this uncomfortable environment, we may be silencing ourselves?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's lots of silences, or the different levels of silence are multiple. I think to begin with, you're working with archives that are very silent to begin with concerning non-normative sexualities. So I would understand why you missed that when you did your MSc, because you're dealing with text and archives that do not capture queerness, or archives that refuse to capture queerness and refuse to give legibility to these diverse lived experiences. So it's very understandable that you're going to have lots of silence to deal with, and that one of the effects is that, for some, I think, is that you're going to silence also the way that you engage with different materials and how you engage with the field in general, especially within contexts where it's very difficult to undertake such research.
And of course, there are these challenges. There are quite many, but as you said in your introduction, that you're also part of the Queer Studies Association, right? I just want us to talk about the opportunities, because even as I go through my literature, there's so much that is interesting, and the more you read, the more you understand that this is a very complex subject, and so much work has been done by African researchers. But you also speak of the very heavy bias, to the study of the South African situation, probably because of the constitution that is a bit much more open. Do you think that the other regions of Africa are really focusing on this subject? Are we getting enough from the other regions of Africa? By the way, I think it was my first time encountering a study on the Maghreb region of Africa. I think your publication, or there are several actually, where you focus on this subject in that region.
Yeah, I think one effect of colonialism is that the continent was split into different regions, linguistic regions, I think. And what that did is that it splintered the kind of scholarship that can come out of the continent. So, for example, if you do not have access to friendship, it's going to be difficult to engage with very rich kinds of work that are being done in West Africa or in North Africa. And if you don't speak Portuguese, for example, it's going to be difficult to read and engage with work that's coming out of Mozambique or Angola, for example. So I think, yeah, there's a need to rethink, to decolonize the way we approach queer studies in Africa, and to think of a Pan-African kind of dialogue between these different regions that have been fragmented owing to differences in languages. And I've been very fortunate myself, because I speak English and French. So that allows me to access a wider kind of archive than someone who's monolingual and only has to refer to a single kind of archive, or to refer to texts that have been translated. And I do feel that at times a lot is lost in translation. So yeah, there is lots of stuff that's happening in other regions, in other languages, and if we do not have access to those languages, the linguistic apparatuses to deal with knowledge that is being produced in these different regions, it's very difficult to get a very global picture of what is happening on the African continent in terms of queer studies.
Mm. And speaking of the archives, I find this very interesting because now there is a focus on the queer digital archives, that you are getting more and more images of queerness, especially on social media. And early this year, myself and Dr. Princess, we presented a paper on, presented, it was a conference presentation on queerness and how it appears in the digital sphere in Zimbabwe, and how that really challenges the master narratives or the dominant narratives that highlight, queer hostility. That, we now have all these, manifestations of queerness happening, and the complex lives of queer people are now playing out, on digital media. I wonder what you make of this digital presence of queerness, especially in spaces where queerness have been silenced.
Mhm. Yeah, that's an interesting observation. And I think I said a bit earlier that if you look at a country like Zimbabwe, the National Archives are very silent about queerness. When they do speak or make reference to queerness, is to pathologize queerness. So what do you do in such a situation where you've got National Archives leading queer lived experiences? And I think social media has allowed for the creation and the curation of alternative archives of being. So I think like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, even Twitter are all important ways of creating alternative platforms in which lived experiences can be curated and can circulate quite easily, I think. Because if you look at the National Archives and ask yourself how many people have got access to those archives compared to social media like TikTok. So accessing National Archives is normally very difficult. There are sets of rules of things that you can and cannot do. You can take pictures, you can't take pictures, you can't take photocopies and stuff like that. And I think social media allows for the creation of alternative spaces of dialogue as well, of creating alternative and counter archives to make sense of these lived experiences and bodies that are normally omitted and needed from national archives and national narratives of what the nation states are, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps just lastly from me, just thinking about the opportunities, especially within the African context, the opportunities of theorizing non-normative sexualities. If you look at the developments that have been happening in the academy, much as there are still challenges, I think that there are people like yourself who actually do this work and have a research output that is visible, that is out there, that emerging scholars like myself are engaging with. What do you make of the opportunities that could be there, especially to develop the subject of queerness and really have solid theorization? Because the other thing is that not only are we theorizing queerness in Africa, there's also the global north that is also doing the same. And as we have learned that there are stereotypical ways in which queerness is theorized in Africa. One of them being that the whole continent is homophobic, and as an African academic, the one thing that you also do is to speak back to these dominant narratives from the global north. What do you make of this? Are there opportunities that are coming up to actually significantly contribute to the theorization of queerness in Africa by African researchers?
Yeah, I think to understand the opportunities that exist, and it's important to also look at the past of scholarship on the continent, or the past of scholarship on queer Africanness. And I think this speaks to, well, there's need to ask who has been doing scholarship on African queerness, and where have these people been doing this research from? And I think a scholar like Stella Nyanzi is very radical in her approach to this question, and she says it's important to look beyond the Michel Foucault's, the Judith Butler's, and that although like non-African Africanists like Mark Epprich have done considerable work and significant work in making queer Africanness known, it's also very important to go beyond the scholars from the global north. But at the same time, I think of what Grace Musila says when she says that we can't completely dismiss knowledge that has been generated by scholars from the global north, and that we can't completely do away with the kind of epistemologies and bodies of work that they've created on African queerness. And I think Musila says that trying to dismiss this kind of scholarship from the global north, when we do that, we also dismiss the kind of work that has been done by Africans, because that knowledge from the global north does not exist in isolation. It exists in dialogue with the continent and what is happening on the continent. So I think it's very important not to, well, in as much as decolonizing is important, it's also important to acknowledge the kind of the role that Africa and African scholarship has done in shaping global north perspective and epistemologies. And at the same time, I think it's important because we should not try to reinvent a world that is already existing. So what's important is to offer fresh and different perspectives from African scholars, from people who live on the continent and who have experiences or daily experiences, engaging with what the Judith Butlers and Michel Foucaults have said on issues that have to do with queerness in Africa. And I think there have been very interesting interlocutors from Africa who have dealt with perspectives of lived experiences on the continent. And I'm thinking of scholars like Kekuro Macharia, S.M. Nyek, Anema Ajupom, or Zethu Matebeng in South Africa. So I think we do have lots of scholars who've taken up the challenge of offering perspectives from the continent. And there's also very young interlocutors like yourself and Princess who've also been doing very interesting and very brave work from very restrictive and accommodating places on the continent.
We are truly taking that compliment, and thank you, Prof. At this point, I would like to invite others in the form of questions and comments from the floor. And Princess?
I'd like to go first, yeah.
Sure.
Thank you so much for a very insightful conversation, to an extent heart-touching as well. When you were sharing your story, Prof, about how people problematized your hand gestures, and then you were told to kind of tone it down or to edit yourself so that whatever you're saying becomes acceptable, which is quite sad. And I guess this goes for many of us. I mean, this work takes a lot of courage. It's like you're daring a space which when you speak, an identity is imputed upon you. So it's either if you're already queer, it becomes an involuntary coming out, because already the moment you start researching around queer studies, it is assumed that you are queer. If you're not, then also it's an imputed identity where people associate you with what you are writing on. So thank you for that. My question is or was, you spoke about the challenges and I wanted to zone in on the opportunities again. What are the opportunities for all this, for us young scholars who are during this space? And where do you see queer scholarship going? Yeah, African queer scholarship. Like, I'm now looking into the future.
Yeah, I think what needs to be done to begin with is to deal with the kinds of challenges that scholars are facing. And there's this interesting phrase that Grace Mosela uses, that when we generate knowledge or produce knowledge, we have to tiptoe. Well, in her article, she's referring to how Black scholars have to tiptoe around white sensitivities in spaces like Stellenbosch. And I'm thinking that there's need for scholars of non-normative sexualities to get away from this idea of having to tiptoe around straight or heteronormative sensitivities, so that we're able to produce the kinds of work that needs to be done, the brave work that needs to be done, and to think of new ways of understanding queer lived experiences on the continent. I think as long as we have to tiptoe around sensitivities and have to deal with avoiding certain topics like Clayton mentioned, it's difficult to have or to explore the kind of full potential that the scholarship we produce, that young scholars can produce. So I think it's really important to look beyond, or to work and to navigate the challenges that we face, for us to be able to see the full potential of our scholarship.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. I see there are questions in the chat box, please. Should we go through them?
Yeah, sure. May I start with a contribution from Melusi Mtunga? Mtunga says, Xavier Livermore, I think I'm right there, advances the notion of usable spaces in relation to queer geographies. We are seeing that queer individuals are now making use of social media as a usable space to create and curate archives of the expressions of their identities in ways that expand the queer archive. And that is so refreshing and affirming to see. It will be exciting to see more studies that explore the digital archive as a space where histories and experiences are kept for future generations. I think this is a comment there on what we see on social media on queerness and visibility, and also what I think is resistance, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I also see this comment and a question from Precious Simba. It says, great talk. African scholarship is filtered down by the maze of internet algorithms. How do we challenge this in order to make sure incredible work such as yours becomes accessible to scholars all over the continent? Also, what about implication by association? How do we get around this practically? I think that's for you, Prof.
Okay, I'll try and answer those questions. Thanks a lot, Precious. On the question of algorithms, I don't think I have the expertise to answer on that, but what I can speak about is paywalls and how scholarship produced by scholars from Africa continues to be behind paywalls that many people cannot access. And it's very frustrating, I think, at times when we try to access a paper by someone based in Africa and you're not able to access it because they want like $30 for you to download a paper. And yeah, which is something that speaks to a very big problem in how knowledge production is so capitalist and how accessing important work and scholarship continues to be governed by global capitalist standards. And for me personally, what I do is if someone sends me an email asking me for my work, and yeah, I will email them everything that I've written. I have no problems sharing my work, even though I know that like publishers would not be happy about that. I think it's good to have your work out there and being accessible to people who need it. And I also think like spaces like the Conversation Africa that allow people to write articles that are very accessible to lay people or people that are not in the academy are very good spaces as well, in that they democratize the knowledge creation space.
Mm. I can actually relate with the issue of access coming from where I come from. That you know, there are some resources that at some point I needed. So I would see the title and like, yes, finally you read the abstract, you want to access it, but you know, there's that paywall, and that's where it ends. And I'm thinking of issues of access beyond my current access to the Wits library. So I really get uncomfortable about that. So there's a question coming from, not a question rather, but a comment from Tinashe Koronga. He's saying he's interested in learning about queer studies from the African perspective. I'm from the health field, and I often find language used in health strategies, especially HIV, in programming, pathologizing queerness. That's a comment from Tinashe there.
Oh yeah, so there are a couple of scholars that have introduced themselves in the chat box, and I see that we have scholars from various disciplines who are all interested, or their work somehow intersects with queer studies. I see Chipom Koki, I see Kensani. I think we may at this point actually open it up to the scholars to also hear about their own experiences researching in this particular area. Anyone who would love to share about their experiences? Oh, there's a question from Picture Masango. Has queer research in Africa to date contributed to evolution in global LGBTIQ plus language, definitions, and perspectives to include African contexts and lived realities? Also appreciating that Africa is a diverse continent.
This one goes to the Prof.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's interesting work which has been done on how different languages navigate and make sense of queerness and queer lived experiences. For example, in North Africa, there's been interesting work on moving away from terminologies that frame queerness in terms of the sex act only. For example, I think, yeah, in North Africa, in Arabic, they use terms like the inserter or the inserted to talk about male queerness, for example. And I think younger generations have been creating new terms that make sense of their lived experiences and how queerness is not just about the sex, and that it's a very expansive set of lived experiences and a lifestyle, and not just a sex act. So I think there's been a movement in North Africa, for example, from just framing queerness as something that people do, to framing queerness as something that people are.
Yeah. Anybody who would love to share their own experiences? I see, Kensan, you're researching from a legal perspective. Then Tinashe from a health perspective. Still trying to go through the chat box. There's somebody who was researching on or is interested in queer studies, but they're looking at, I think, children's rights. That should be Chipom Koki, if you're around. Would love to know your experiences. Okay, there's another contribution there. Wokang Lipolo says, to start with, finding a supervisor in a field is very difficult, especially at PhD level. University of Pretoria, through Center for Human Rights, has made considerable contribution in the field. Most of the writings are from the center. That's super true. I think it speaks to what the professor was also speaking about, to even say that at some point he was, I mean, the idea of queer studies was questioned. So I think that is what he is speaking to, or they are speaking to. Anybody would love to share their experiences in terms of what they're researching on? Okay, that's...
Princess, then I have to put you in the spotlight here from a conversation that we had a few days ago when we were preparing for this. You mentioned something that I found quite interesting, which speaks to how diverse this field is and how perhaps someone like me may not understand the complexity. You spoke about sex work being part of non-normative sexualities. I really want you to express that, because this is something that you have studied, you did your field work on this subject, you've got so much experience. I just want you to elaborate on this, and yeah.
Okay. So I was basically saying that for me, sex work is queer, not just in the sense that they are queer individuals within sex work, like transgender individuals, but in terms of how it disrupts the heteronorm, heteropatriarchal norms in our society, because it's usually considered that looking at what people are used to, sex work is between a woman and a man, and usually the woman is the performer, and then there's a client, right, who's a man, who's male. And I was saying the idea that the woman, from even when we're using that lens, this woman goes onto the street and performs, so they are soliciting, and already they are challenging the idea that a man has to sort of like initiate and seek after a woman for sex. So it's like so many levels, and even the idea of having to make a male client pay for sex, which is usually considered to be a service that women should provide for free. So it's a lot of things which I thought, okay, sex work should, obviously, it's non-normative sexuality for me, because it's also happening within a space that is, it straddles between the public and the private. So it challenges heteronormative principles in a number of ways. That is even before we start considering that actually sex work is diverse. There's so many gender representations in sex work. In fact, right now at the moment in Zimbabwe, for example, male sex work is on the rise, but nobody really talks about it, or the image of a sex worker that comes to mind is usually a female cisgender hetero female sex worker. So I was considering sex work as a form of queer or non-normative sexual expression.
Thank you for that. I wouldn't let you go without telling us about that.
Oh yeah. I think at this point, we may want to give it back to Catherine in the interest of time.
There is one more question from Jillian. Should I read it? Can I read it? I would like to ask a question about accessibility beyond academia. I like what Prof is saying about the conversation and sharing conversations in the layperson space. What are some ways in which we can think about this into other spaces and institutions like, dare I say, schools and society more widely? Can I hand over that question to Clayton and Prof Ncube?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I think it's always important to decenter knowledge and the kinds of conversations that are possible from the ivory tower of the academy, and move those important conversations to spaces where it matters the most, to the communities, to where people live every day. So we can't continue having conferences where your academics just exchanging ideas without involving the lay people, the ordinary people, the people who have to live queer lives. So I think it's very important to decenter the academy and move conversations to spaces beyond the academy. I'm not too sure what you think, Clayton.
Yeah, I've seen here in Zimbabwe, there are organizations that are into queer advocacy. I've seen them trying to engage the media. It's also another opportunity, you know, for this conversation. I've seen that they try to have these conversations with journalists to say, perhaps it's time we leave this hostile language and this hostile approach and, you know, focus on the, you know, from the humanity perspective, be more humane in the way we talk about this subject. But of course, there are challenges there because media are formed in different ways. They've got their set processes of production that may make it difficult for them to effect change. Usually, change in institutions like the media are really on a slow lane. So you understand that. But what some of us have done is to try and write about it. But again, you know, you may find space in media that may be seen as elitist. Here I'm talking about where I publish the Mail and Guardian. Perhaps it may not be as accessible like the local media here, but are the local media ready to have that conversation? Perhaps they prefer to stick to stereotypes, but that's where the opportunities are. And I think some of the organizations that are working around in Zimbabwe by engaging journalists is a good starting point, hoping that we may reap something out of it in the future. You know, we have, you know, conversations that are less hostile and conversations that really look at queerness as a complex subject and not a simple linear thing where you know, just invectives and insults and many of the other stuff that is undesirable that you really find in the media, hoping that we may move beyond that. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may also add that I think I've seen on social media like Facebook and Twitter where people are able to discuss different issues. Like I'm reminded of when the film Ingleba, the one from South Africa, was released, and how on their Facebook page, if you read the comment section, you have people actually discussing issues to do with non-normative sexualities in a very humane way in which it espouses Ubuntu, and how people don't need to throw in very hurtful words in discussing different issues. I think social media also opens up these spaces of engagement that are away from the academy and academic conferences.
Yeah, I've also observed the way people engage on this subject on social media, on South African, what they call South African Twitter, Zimbabwean Twitter, and Nigerian Twitter. I think those are the kind of subjects that I usually follow on particularly on Twitter. And I think much as you have the homophobia playing out in the expressions that you find there, I think there is really a good dosage of conversations that are not hostile, that approach queerness from a humane perspective. And I think that's a great point, really, that social media is kind of making that sort of a difference. It's showing that homophobia is not the dominant way in which queerness is viewed across the continent, and these are contributors who are based in Africa. So that's a great way of approaching, of seeing how people approach the subject of queerness.
Catherine?
Yeah. So sorry, I want to now jump in because from a different perspective, I read a newspaper article a few weeks ago about the shift that came into the study of biology when women became biologists. So as soon as women became biologists, the interpretation and access sort of information about animal behavior completely was revolutionized. And we began to understand elephant behavior, chimpanzee behavior, various behaviors in a completely different way, because women were looking at it through their lens and revealing things that were never seen by male scientists, just because they were bringing their patriarchal lens. And so I'm quite interested in, for example, how a queer studies lens can bring insight into other fields of study that kind of reveals things that have kind of been hidden simply because the lens wasn't there. I was wanting to know what you thought about that and if you've seen any of that. Clayton, Prof, Princess. For example, Princess, what you were saying about sex work is an insight from a lens that we wouldn't be able to have that insight without a queer studies approach. So I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, Prof, would you?
Yeah, I think queerness does allow for other perspectives to come out in how we understand different things. For example, like sociology, psychology. A queer lens allows us to think beyond the usual heteronormative ways in which we've considered, for example, how people relate to each other in sociology or how anthropology is done. I think the queer lens allows us to imagine new ways of understanding these fields. And also the power dynamics that are involved in many of these fields.
Great. Okay, yeah. Clayton, do you want to add anything before we move on?
No, I think the Prof has made it quite clear.
Okay. Yeah, I feel that we've definitely come to the end of a really fascinating foray into the subject of African academia and non-normative sexuality research. Thank you so much, Prof. Ncube and Clayton and Princess, for your contributions. What I want to do now very, very quickly is just share the next two talks that are coming up in the next couple of months. Let me just shoot through to the back of the presentation. So in November the 18th, we'll be talking about public health discourses in Africa. So queer communities and public health discourses in Africa. There's a couple of people here who may be interested in the subject just based on your areas of interest and what has brought you here in the first place. So very much look forward to you joining us again on November the 18th. Then next year, I don't know how to move my head out of the way, February the 24th, same time, 4 o'clock, we'll be talking about Ubuntu and non-normative sexualities. Princess, do you want to add like a little, just a quick like like a teaser about what people can expect?
Okay, yeah, already when people were sharing their profiles, I could almost see how we can actually have some of them as guests, because we can still have more people. But basically we want to make sure that we kind of discuss queer studies from as many or from various disciplines and angles as possible. So we're looking at also discussing religion and queer studies, or religion and queerhood, if there's something as such. Also how even the law, its relations with the queer individual, the queer collective in Africa. So we're trying to look at it from different perspectives. So definitely we're going to have more people come through, especially if I could see Kensani there, one of our scholars who's doing an LLM that also intersects with the queer subject. So yeah, we're looking forward to exploring it from different angles and having as many voices as possible, because I think this is part of the work to begin to talk about it.
Great. And there's Tinashe Koronga as well. I think we saw his profile. Please take note of that. You may want to be a part of that as well.
Yeah, and if anybody has an interesting topic that they want to feature on this QueerTalk series, they are open and welcome.
Cool, excellent. Okay, this is great. Let's just, I think we'll end here and look forward to seeing you once again in November. Thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Clayton. Thanks, Princess. Bye, everybody.
Thank you and
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.